So you've been there yourself.
I have. Not exactly there, but close.
Yeah. Drugs tend to lead you. They open the door for all of that.
Oh, they opened the doors for a lot of things.
So tell me your story. You're from where?
So I grew up out in Canyon Country.
Oh, right here.
Yep.
Suburb of L.A., right?
Yes, born and raised here. And I come from a family of alcoholics. So it was a tumultuous upbringing. My father left my mom when they were quite young. She had 3 children back to back from 17, 18, and 19. And so just not having that family stability kind of set up some interesting dynamics internally for me. And, I just was an immoral character long before I had a first drink or a drug. I just liked to kind of stand on this side of the law. I liked to make money, so I went into loan sharking by the time I was 14. And you didn't not pay your contracts. I had one young teenage boy who said he lost his job and couldn't pay my contract, so I went and hired a football player, and I want my money. You signed the dotted line. And that's just kind of who my character was. I couldn't identify it at the time, but just a very tough exterior, just not a lot of connection with humans, not a lot of empathy. And then violence is a big part of my background. For me, seeking out that violence made me feel safe. I know that's kind of a oxymoron, but my father was very violent, so I believed he must have loved me. And so I just kept trying to replicate that. I ran away from home when I was 15. I was a straight-A student, and I ran away from home, and within a year and a half, I was putting needles in my arm and drinking every day. So my life got very, very out of control very, very quickly. And then I lived on Sierra Highway out in Canyon Country with my soon-to-be husband. I was 17 and a drug dealer. And we got robbed one night, and the drug dealer got shot 4 times, and my soon-to-be husband got shot once. But I was so detached from that. I didn't really have a lot of feelings about it. I didn't think, they're going to bleed to death. I went into the bathroom. I wrapped the drug dealer up with T-shirts to try and stop the blood, but I was mostly afraid for me. I'm 17, cops are gonna come, I don't wanna go to jail. And, I don't know what I thought about living that kind of life. It just seemed okay for me. I remember one time my brother came to that house and said to me, you need to come home. Mom has a gun to her head. And I just said to my brother, well, then she can just shoot herself because I'm not going home. And, to just be that kind of detached, now looking back, what was really going on in my life at that time to kind of create those kind of barriers to family at such a young age. I had my son at, I guess I was 18, so by the time I had him, I was 19. And I didn't think about, what kind of mom am I going to be? I just thought, I will love my son, and everything will be fine. I didn't think about stability. I didn't think about structure. I didn't think about what impact I was going to have. And I had my son, and within 2 weeks after having him, I was using again and dragging him to my bragging was he could go to a big party in the mountains with a live band and sleep. Like, he was that kind of baby. And I didn't really think about, the impact on his life that was going to have. He was a really good baby, very good looking. Everyone called him the Gerber baby, just very happy, but very, very active. I still have his little baby shoes from when he was first born, and the toes are worn out from him, like, moving his legs in the little bassinet. So he just was, like, always on the go. And I knew by the time he hit 2, we were going to have a hard ride. I mean, coming from a family of alcoholics, you know the patterns. And I didn't, now as a mom, it's very different. But I created a lot of damage there by not being able to show up for him and provide him the structure any child needs. I put a lot of very dangerous men in his life. When he was about 6 months old, I picked up a hitchhiker in the valley, and, we went to my son's preschool to pick him up, and we went to a bar and got drunk. Like, it didn't occur to me that that wasn't normal. And the bartender said to me, like, "Lady, you can't bring that baby in here." And I just turned to the bartender and said, "He's a baby. He's not going to drink. Like, what's the problem?" And I felt perfectly justified. He's not going to drink. He's a baby. Like, why wouldn't I bring him? He's with me. He's safe. I'm loving him. That's what he needs. And fast forward a little bit, that hitchhiker would go back and forth to jail, and I would go back and forth to my son's father. I had another baby. And when my daughter was 4 and my son was 9, that hitchhiker was at our house. I was at work, and he called me at work and told me that my 4-year-old daughter was asleep on his chest. And I said to him, "You're not supposed to be there." And he said, "I know, but I needed a safe place to go." So I told him he could hang out there for a few hours. And then 6 hours later, I got a call from him, and he had killed 2 people and seriously maimed another. And my son, at 9 years of age, testified to the fact that he had that murder weapon in our home that day. And it took me a long time in recovery to realize the amount of unsafe situations I had placed my children in. I don't know what I was thinking then, but obviously I wasn't thinking about their safety. I know now my son started drinking and using at 9 years of age. Sometimes I wonder if that was a catalyst for that. When he was 5, 6 years old, he had a very interesting personality. He would only wear gray clothes, gray pants, gray shirts, gray hat. And in order to continue to connect with him, I would have to kind of look at his clothes and think, well, he's, pressing them, laying them out the night before, being very careful. If it was a 3-piece business suit, you would be very proud of him. But he was a very difficult child, just into a lot of things. He would climb up on the roof of my house without any real thought process to the consequences.
This is what age, roughly?
5. And, I was not in a place where I knew how to channel that kind of energy. Maybe if I had more stability, things could be different. We started seeing a psychiatrist when he was 6. He was diagnosed at that time having signs of schizophrenia, which, as you know, is very, very, very young. And that just kind of started our journey of trying to find things to help him, help me. The school system was a little bit different. He was in school, but he couldn't sit still long enough to read or write. By the time he hit the 2nd grade, he was illiterate. I had his IQ tested. He was almost Einstein genius level. So I fought with the school to have him placed in special ed. That wasn't the best place for him, but it was better than mainstream school. It was 2 teachers, 12 students, much more structured environment. And he spent almost 3 years and came out of there being able to read and write. But our relationship was challenged. I felt very inadequate as a parent to him. He was very smart, would ask questions like, I remember one time we were driving in the car and he said to me, "Are you in love with me, Mom?" And I said, "Of course I love you." He was like maybe 7. I said, "Of course I love you." He says, "I didn't ask you if you loved me. I asked you if you are in love with me." And I said, "Well, what is the difference?" And he said, "Do you want to marry me?" And I said, "No, I'm your mom." And then he said, "Well, then could you please turn off the the love music on the radio?" Which I quickly did. But it kind of took me back to realize that this really young boy had thought processes like that. And I just didn't know how to navigate that. He was in the 5th grade. They transitioned him back into regular school. And at that point, I really lost control of his discipline, structure. He was getting into a lot of trouble. I did not know what to do. I took him to a lot of school counseling sessions, community counseling. When he was 13, I don't know if they have it still, but they had truant officers. And so I would turn him into the truant officer when he wouldn't go to school, hoping that someone would step up and point us in the right direction. He went to his first juvenile camp at 15. I remember being in the court with the attorney, and the attorney was saying something to me. And I remember just feeling like this sense of overwhelming fear. And I said to the attorney, "Please don't send my son home with me." Now looking back, I could see there was a tremendous amount of fear that I had with his behavior. He was very volatile. And so he went into a juvenile camp, and my son always does well in a very structured environment. I got to be a mom to him. He got to be a son for me. And they would let him call me on the phone. I would go and visit him. And then he got out. And within a week, he was running the streets again. And at the age of 15, I relinquished custody of him to the courts as incorrigible. Tough love was the movement then, and I believed I was doing the right thing. He went into a boys' home in Woodland Hills, and 30 days later, he AWOL'd. And from 15 to 22, he spent homeless on the streets. And that was, like, now I can see the destructive decisions, how that was not a good decision for him. But I didn't see any other paths. I got into recovery right after that. And then my journey started to change me. It was a very difficult journey. I had to give up a lot of behaviors that not only just drinking and drugging, but the violence, the, very violent men, that whole kind of destructive lifestyle. And I really kept him at arm's length because I was very afraid of him.
Of your son?
Yes. And I remember one time I could hear something on the roof of my house, and I came out of my house, and he was sleeping, living on the roof. It was a flat roof over the bedroom, and he had a sleeping bag up there. And I remember saying to him, like, "What are you, crazy?" And he just kind of looked at me and said to me, "Yeah, I think maybe I am." And, it just, hindsight is very, telling, because now I can look back and see, this child was crying out for help and wanting, some direction, but I didn't know how to provide that. And there didn't seem to be resources to be able to provide that. He went into his first hospital for suicide at 22. And from that point, he's 42 now. He's had 9 suicide attempts that have placed him in ICU. But from 22 to about 32, 33, I worked on me, getting into recovery, changing my life, changing my lifestyle. When my son grew up, we lived in a house that was full of holes in the walls, graffiti all over the walls. Just a really rough beginning for him. So I had spent those years like really cleaning that up, making changes for me and my daughter. And I was 12 years sober, and I decided to ride my Harley Davidson from California to New York by myself and raise money for charity. And my son was in a mental institution in Pomona. And up until this point, our relationship was difficult. He was very resentful. He blamed me for a lot of his troubles, rightfully so. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking, putting a 15-year-old on the streets to fend for themselves. Like, what are they going to do but get into trouble? And even though, in my recovery, I tried to make amends, I tried to make that up to him, he just couldn't find forgiveness. And I would go and visit him in the mental hospital. He was there for 9 months, and every week I would go and sit and have dinner with him. And some of those visits would be okay, and some of those visits he would be very angry, and I would have to leave.
Tell me about his father.
So his dad was also an alcoholic, and they really had no relationship. His dad would call. Both my children have the same father. His dad would call and say, "I'm going to come and pick you and your sister up." And then he wouldn't show up. And I remember when my son was about maybe 10, I called his dad and was like, look, I need some help with him. Like, you need to be his dad. And his dad said to me, you messed him up, you fix him, and refused to kind of step up and be a parent. His dad has since passed away. He was drinking and driving and crashed.
Tell me a little more about his dad. He had a job? Or what kind of?
He did have a job. He was a mechanic. Him and I met in high school, so we were quite young. He came from a very good family, but both him and his brother were alcoholics, but he always worked. I remember he loved Baja bugs, and he would rebuild Volkswagens into Baja bugs, was a good mechanic. And, he just was well-liked by his friends, but he really just didn't know how to be a father, be a parent.
So that put the whole job on you.
Correct. Yeah, it was difficult. It was hard for my son. Like, having a father was very important to him, and he would want to connect with his dad, but it just was very difficult.
Okay, so your son was in the institution?
Yeah, so I was 12 years in recovery. He was in an institution, and I remember he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and handed it to me and said, I want you to give this to your charity. I'm very proud of you for what you're doing. And that was like the first time I really felt like I connected with my son in a way that perhaps he had found some forgiveness for me. And he was medicated in that institution that I'm sure had some help. But unfortunately, when they're released from the institutions, there's not really a plan for them. They just kind of open the door and put them back out onto the streets. And, he just couldn't stay in recovery. He couldn't stay on the path. A lot of hospital visits, a lot of suicide attempts. It just was tough. It was really tough. And by his third or fourth suicide attempt, I decided this isn't working. Like, leaving you on the streets is not working. And I went and picked him up and put him in a little apartment in Pomona, really still not having an idea of how to navigate his mental illness. Like, I knew where I could help him with drugs and alcohol, but the schizophrenia, I had no real education about that.
The schizophrenia when did schizophrenia show up in his?
So when I really started seeing it was about 19 years old. Of course, looking back, I can see, like I said, his dressing patterns, very obsessive, very compulsive, but the voices and stuff about when he was 19. And he spent a lot of time going to mental institutions down here in Santa Monica, a lot of hospitals. And, the system is interesting because if you're suicidal today, but in an hour from now you're not, then they let you go without a plan. And, he's out there trying to figure out how to navigate life. I don't know what to do. He's living in this apartment in Pomona, and I'm encouraging him, go to the local mental health center. You have to get some help there. But I don't really know how to navigate that. And one day he called me, and said to me that someone had let off a bomb in his apartment. So it was 4:30 in the morning, and I started driving to Pomona down the 118 freeway. And for some reason, I thought about looking at the NAMI website, National Alliance for Mental Illness, and it talked about like how to communicate with someone who's in a mental break. And up until then, when my son would talk to me about the voices and the things he was experiencing, I would tell him, that's not true, that's not happening. He would say things like, I sold him to the government as a baby. They put things in his brain. I'm like, that's not true. And I would always kind of argue with him. And the NAMI website, the way I read it was, you don't have to tell them what they're saying is true, but you also don't have to argue with them. So I thought I would try a different tactic. And I got to his place, and I could tell that he was very, very agitated. And I had called the police, and they had said to me, well, there's really nothing that we can do, but you can call for a welfare check. So I called the mental health hotline, and they said it would take them about 2.5 hours to arrive. So I get there, and I don't want to close the door. I'm afraid to go into the apartment with my son because he's very agitated. And so I sit on a paint bucket at the front door, and I just start interacting with him different. He would tell me, they're transmitting my thoughts on the TV. He had broken his TV, and I would say things like, that must be very scary. That must be very difficult. And I could see him visibly relax. And at one point, he kind of tipped his head to the side and said to me, how come you're not arguing with me anymore? And I said, well, I just decided that maybe I should listen to you and maybe take what you're saying as truth for you. And for 2.5 hours, he kind of talked about still his delusions, but there was no aggressiveness. Like he was relaxed, and it was just sharing. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I want the mental people to get here because this is way beyond my experience. And about 2.5 hours into that, it was just like a switch went off, and I saw him go from very calm to very aggressive again. And he said to me, you want to see how I live? And he slammed the apartment door. He put a 2x4 in a bracket, and then he walked into the bedroom and brought out a shotgun and repeatedly pointed that shotgun at himself and at me. And, if you have kids, he would point that gun at himself, and I would step forward to try and protect him, and then the barrel of the shotgun would come down, and I would step back. I have to protect me. And it was such a difficult, teetering back and forth, what is going to happen here? And I knew that now that we were barricaded in the apartment, if the police came, that my son possibly would not survive because now I'm a hostage. And so then my concern became, get out of the apartment. And so I begged him, please let me out. He was very angry with me, but he did let me out. And as I came down the staircase, the mental health people were pulling up, and I just said to them, he has a gun. And the next thing that happened is the SWAT arrived. They shut down the street.
It's like he had you hostage?
I had gotten out of the apartment by then, but he was in the...
Did you feel like a hostage?
100%. 100%. I mean, I did not know what was going to happen in that situation. A loaded shotgun is a very dangerous thing in anyone's hands, let alone someone who's in a psychotic break. So...
How many hours was that?
So he was I was held hostage with him for 45 minutes. He was barricaded there for 6 hours. So the SWAT team negotiated with him for 6 hours. And then finally he said, I'll come out if you let me see my mom. And I was afraid. At that point, I didn't want to get into the middle of this. And I remember the SWAT guy put me behind him and said, just stay behind me. And I said to him, can I hold your hand? Because I was so afraid. And it was such a, difficult place to be as a parent. I don't want to be afraid of my son. I know he doesn't particularly want to hurt me, but the illness, his delusions, what he's thinking. And my son came out of the apartment with the gun, and he finally put the gun down and surrendered. And at that point, the SWAT team said to me, he has a gunshot wound to the face, and they were going to transport him to San Bernardino Hospital.
Your son shot
himself.
In the face?
Correct.
Wow.
Then the officers said to me that they heard that gunshot about 10 or 15 minutes after I left the apartment, but they didn't want to say anything prior to that. And so they transported him to San Bernardino, and I went down to the hospital, and, they had to place 6 plates in his face. And they 5150'd him at that point because he was, saying things like, I don't want you to fix my face. I want it to stay like that. And, that's not normal. So he spent a week in the hospital, and then they moved him to the mental institution. And in those 10 days that he was in the mental institution, I tried to get him conserved. Everyone I had talked to said, based on these circumstances, it should be very simple, and it was not. After the first week of contacting the authorities, I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere. So I hired a mental health attorney. I paid him $10,000. And he couldn't get anywhere. And I begged the hospital, you're going to let this man out. He didn't get better in 2 weeks. He has one place to go, and that's to mom. And I'm terrified. So this is not going to turn out well. And the mental hospital said they were going to release him on Monday. And I called the police officer that was the head of the SWAT team and begged him, please, you have to help me. Like, my son's gonna die if he gets out. Like, this is not gonna go well. And he did. He stepped up. He went in. The mental hospital let my son out on a Friday, and he went and picked up my son. And by Monday, they had charged him with something. I don't know what it was, but he got 9 months in county jail. And every week I would go and see him. Now, I walked away from that situation with severe PTSD, and I knew that I had to get better or I would never be able to be with my son again. So I would go to the jail every week. It was, sometimes it was okay, and sometimes my son was very, very hostile, and I would have to leave the visit. And I was getting outside help. I went to NAMI. I started facilitating classes at NAMI to help other parents. I thought, well, if my experiences can help others, then it's not wasted. And when my son was about to exit, the authorities at the jail said to him, "The only reason why you're here is because of your mom, and we're going to let you out without probation." And, that was the hard part of the system, is I always felt like they kind of pitted me and my son against each other. And it put me in a dangerous position and would feed his resentment to me. I was trying to be mean to my son. I'm trying to save his life. I'm trying to protect him and I in the only avenue that the door will open for us. He got out, and I spent the next 5 years trying to navigate the mental health system with him. It takes their buy-in. I couldn't get his buy-in. I read a lot of books. I went to a lot of NAMI. I educated myself. I learned about how to communicate with someone in a psychotic break. My relationship with my son did change from that perspective. We weren't at so many odds, but his behavior didn't change. And I was 5 years. I think his shooting was in 2014, so 2019, I decided that I can't stay here anymore. We had gone through a couple domestic violence trials where I've tried to get him into the mental health courts. And again, I felt pitting mother against son. And I felt it was damaging our relationship more than it was helping any situation. And so I gave up. And I had a big corporate job, and I owned a home, and my whole life was here. And I left it all. I sold my house. I sold most of my things. And a week before I left California, my house was in escrow. My son broke into my home, and I wasn't home at the time. The police called and said to me, "You need to come home." And by the time I got there, the helicopter was circling my house, and they were calling my son's name out on the intercom, and he surrendered. And, I left. I disappeared. No one really knew where I was. I actually flew overseas. I didn't want to stay in the United States.
Because you were afraid?
Because I was afraid. And I by this time now, he's very unpredictable. And I don't want to believe he would hurt someone, But I never believed he would have a gun either. And he did. And so I wasn't willing to be behind a gun again. And so I knew that leaving him behind was a huge risk, because he's not better. He's probably gonna die, and very quickly, which is a hard place for a parent to get to know that you just have to let it happen. And it was difficult. It was very difficult. He did go to jail over breaking into my house, and then, of course, was let out again, and another few suicide attempts. And then they found him by a trash can behind a fast food restaurant, cold to the touch and kidney failure. And he went into the hospital. He did dialysis for 90 days. He's, 40, 39, 40. That's very young for your body to be shutting down like that. And then he left the dialysis hospital and started running the streets again. And I was still talking to him on the telephone, but he didn't know where I was. And I stopped communication with him completely at that point. I felt like I was doing more harm than good. I couldn't encourage him anymore. I couldn't encourage him anymore. I couldn't find that empathy, that compassion anymore. And so I stopped speaking with him. Shortly after that, he committed a assault and went to prison. And my husband has experience with working with young people in prison. My husband spent a lot of time in prison, has turned his life around, and he started mentoring my son. So he started speaking with him for the 2 years that I didn't. And I've watched my son slowly change, slowly take some responsibility. Every once in a while, we'd kind of touch on his shooting, because he would say to me, I don't understand why you got so damaged by that. I have very severe panic attacks. And I would just say to him, well, I don't know why either. I just know I did. What am I going to say to him for that? I'm not going to point my finger at him. I'm not going to, point out the fallacies of his thinking, because he's just not capable of seeing it. So it just was interesting. I started speaking to him again about 1.5 years ago, and 2 weeks ago, he talked to me about the day of the shooting, and he said to me, well, I can see now why that was so difficult, and perhaps it was very scary. And then he said to me, but I did not shoot myself. The gun went off by accident. You know that, don't you? And I said to him, well, I don't know. I wasn't there. And he said, but what I wanted to do is go out in a blaze of glory with the police. And I started laughing. I said, yes, like that's any better. And he was able to laugh. And, some people might think that's a very strange conversation for a parent to have with their child. And perhaps it is, but it's at his level. And I can connect with him where he's at. I could fight and kick and scream and want him to be different, and that does nothing. It does nothing for him, it does nothing for me. Or I can just accept for what it is and just enjoy those moments. Because for me, that was really touching. I felt like him taking a little bit of responsibility, realized gosh, I really put my mom in a dangerous position. And I could feel real empathy and love for him and forgiveness, because sometimes I still feel upset, like I gave up my whole existence.
This really changed
It changed my entire core existence. It changed the way I interacted with life. It changed fundamental thought processes. I used to wear a watch. I quit wearing a watch the day of his shooting because watching time seemed so trivial. And it just was, I really had to evaluate where I was in my life and the people I was involved with, and did I really love this corporate job, and did I really want to be single and live in this 3-bedroom house all by myself? And no, I don't want any of this. It just changed me at a very core level.
Were there medications that helped him?
I don't know. He's very against medication, and that is not a conversation that he's willing to have with me. And so I don't talk about medication with him.
So you have to walk on eggshells around him.
When it comes to that, yes. Yeah, and we see his mental illness very different. That incident with the SWAT team felt very unpredictable to me. It felt just really scary. And for him, it wasn't. Even now, he can still normalize it, I guess, which is part of denial, I think.
But where is he today?
He's still in prison. He'll be out this November. He doesn't know where I live, but my husband still mentors him. So my husband will probably meet him when he comes out of prison and try and navigate him into a recovery program. I don't know what, the prison structure will be when he's released. He's now a 2-strike convicted felon. So if he gets another violent strike, then he goes to prison for the rest of his life on the 3-strike law of California. My husband has helped me a lot because he says to me, he did his time, he paid the price. Now it's time for us to show support for him again and see if he can follow a path of recovery. That's a little bit harder for me. I still feel afraid. So I just let my husband stand in front. You be the support. I'll be the telephone support over here where I can feel a little safer. Let me see what he does. My son and I have had conversations because he'll say to me, I want to come and move closer to you. And I'm very careful how I put it, but I'm like, well, I need to see some stability first and see you be on the right track for a couple years on the outside. It's great to be on track when you're incarcerated. It's very different when you're out here And there's a lot of different elements. So we'll see what happens.
Wow. What a difficult child.
Well, he didn't, I can see now he didn't get where he was at all by himself. The instability of my life played a significant role in that. And I've had to, really work on that. I've been able to help a lot of people, mentor a lot of people that are in the same situation. When I lived here, I did a lot of public speaking with the police department, which also helped, showing that there are loving families behind these people who struggle. Don't forget that they are someone's child. And as difficult as it is for you, it's also very difficult for us. And in a lot of ways, that was healing, because I could see the officers' thought processes behind the homeless and the mentally ill change and just kind of shift a little bit and see more empathy for them and see it from a different perspective, which is very empowering.
What advice would you give, Linda, to a parent of a schizophrenic and possibly violent child?
Keep hope. Keep looking for resources. Now with NAMI, I think there's more resources out there. I think that I've been able to mentor some parents that have had young schizophrenic boys in their early 19, 20, 23, 24. You really, that's when you have to try and really catch that. If you let it go too long, they live that life too long, and it's much harder. My son has never really lived in a home. He's never really lived with a roof over his head besides incarceration. So for him, it's very difficult. So, and even if you have to love your child from afar, keep loving them. That, even if you're just sending it out into the atmosphere. In my case, where I had to completely step away, I still would say to my son in my, dark nights, I love you. I hope you're safe. I hope you know that I love you. Even if I can't talk to you right now, I think it's important as a parent not to have regrets. Because when you have a child who makes those very difficult choices, you have to love them for who they are. You cannot make them different. And if you don't look at those magical moments, then you have nothing. When they're gone, you have no good memories. I have those little tiny gems of love that passed between him and I, maybe not in the way where most people would see it, but if you can just accept them for who they are, then you can see the magic in it, and that's healing.
All right, Linda, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Mark, very much.
Good luck when your son comes out.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. When I was designing the first White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whittaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.